Hello everyone, welcome to this session on Introduction to Programming Paradigms. This session is part of Module 1 of Programming Paradigms, course code CS403. This session is meant for S7 CSE students of APJ Abdul Kalam Technological University. I am Dr. Renu Mary Daniel, Assistant Professor, Department of CSE, Rajagiri School of Engineering and Technology. In this particular session, we will be covering the topics names, scopes and bindings. Once again, welcome to this session.
Paradigm can also be termed as method to solve some problem or do some task. Programming paradigm is an approach to solve problem using some programming language. There are lots of programming languages that are known, but all of them need to follow some strategy when they are implemented, and this methodology or strategy is called paradigm. So what is the major advantage of learning different paradigms? In this particular course you will be learning the different paradigms associated with different kinds of programming languages. We know that there are various categories like procedural programming, you might have heard of object-oriented programming, functional programming, etc. So by studying the paradigms associated with the design of all these languages, there are various advantages, like it gives you increased capacity to express ideas, improved background for choosing appropriate languages for solving different problems, increased ability to learn new languages, and if you are going to design a programming language in the future, then you will be able to identify which particular programming paradigm is suitable for the design of your language. So a programming paradigm is a style or way of programming. All the programming languages that we have learned so far, like C, C++, Java, SQL, all of them are designed based on a specific programming paradigm. So here in the slide you can see a figure depicting the various programming paradigms like imperative, declarative and symbolic. Each of them, except for symbolic, imperative and declarative, are further subdivided into categories like imperative is subdivided into procedural, object-oriented and parallel processing. Examples of procedural programming languages are C, Fortran, object-oriented, C++, Java, parallel processing, Apache Hadoop. Now, declarative programming language is further subdivided into functional, logic and database programming, and their examples are given on the right hand side. And finally we have symbolic programming paradigm, and the examples are Wolfram language and Lisp. Now we'll see the difference between imperative and declarative programming paradigms using some examples. We'll take two languages, one each belonging to each category. Let's take C from imperative programming language and SQL from declarative programming language. Now if you want to perform a specific task like finding the factorial of a number using C, then what we will do is we have to write the step-by-step instruction of how this particular task can be done, how the factorial can be computed. Or if you want to search for whether an element is present in an array in C or C++ or Java for that matter, you have to first write a loop, and then you have to check whether the search element is present in any of the indices of the array. If so, you will say that the element is present, otherwise no. So we have to write the step-by-step instruction of how the task at hand is to be performed in imperative programming languages. Now if you take the case of declarative programming languages, for example SQL, we'll just write a command, select star from database, where column name equal to specific value. Now here we are not at all bothered about how this particular task is being done. We are not giving any step-by-step instruction of how the task is to be done. We are just telling the system what we want. What is the task? That is what we are bothered with. We are not concerned how the task is going to be done. So that is declarative approach. Now when we talk about symbolic programming paradigm, it is a programming paradigm in which the program can manipulate its own formulas and program components as if they were plain data. Now we'll see examples of each of these so you will understand it very clearly. Imperative programming is like how you do something, and declarative programming is more like what you do. Imperative programming approach describes a sequence of steps that change the state of the computer, while declarative programming approach instructs what needs to be done. instead of telling how to do it. So here I have mentioned a small example. This is nothing to do with programming languages. Suppose your friend has come to a mall near your house and he just calls you up and tells you, hey, I'm here in Walmart mall. How do I get to your house from here? So there are two ways of how you can respond to his query. The first one is you can give an entire blueprint of how to reach your home from that particular mall. So you can tell him each and every turns he has to take, each and every streets he has to go to finally reach your home. So the first one is an imperative response. It is like a descriptive answer. So go out to the north exit of the parking lot and take a left. Get on I-15 north until you get the 12th street exit. Take a right off to the exit and so on. And finally you can say, finally you will reach my house, which is house number 298. So this is an imperative approach wherein you are telling your friend exactly what needs to be done to reach your home. Now a declarative response would be just giving him your address. You can tell him my address is 298 West Immutable Alley, Eden, Utah 84310. Now it's up to your friend to take whatever measures to reach your home. He can take any of the possible alternative routes to reach your home. So this is the difference between imperative response and declarative response. So here in this slide I'll be explaining the differences between imperative and declarative programming approaches using a simple Java program. So what we are going to do is we have to check whether a string called Nemo is present in a list called names. The elements in the list are Gil, Dory, Bruce, Nemo and Dala. So in fact in this particular case we should be getting the output that Nemo is found in the list. So in the typical imperative approach of programming, we have to have a for loop or any loop, and then we have to have an if statement to check whether each element in the array is equal to the search string or not. So we have a boolean variable called found here, which is initialized as false, and a for loop. Inside the for loop we will be extracting each and every element in the array to a string called name, and then we are checking within the loop, we are checking if name dot equals Nemo. If it is equal, we'll set found as true, and we'll be exiting from the loop and printing the output Nemo found. Now if the element is not present in the list, then this for loop will execute completely in vain, and at the end the boolean variable found will still be false, and we'll be getting the output Nemo not found. Now the corresponding declarative approach is shown here towards the right hand side. You can see that we are working with the same list called names with the same elements, and here instead of using a for loop and an if statement within the for loop, we are using the method called contains. Now this method essentially does the same function as the for loop and the if statement. It will check if the string called Nemo is present in the array list names. If it is present, it will return true, and the program will print Nemo found. Otherwise it will return false, and the program will print Nemo is not found. Now this particular approach is called declarative approach, since we are not elaborating on what this function or method contains is doing. So here are some more declarative code. The first one is from SQL. The code is select star from users where country equal to Mexico. So we have a table called users with an attribute or column called country, and we want to select all the rows in the table where the condition country equal to Mexico is satisfied. And another example is from HTML, and here when this particular code is executed, we'll have a header called declarative programming along with a paragraph in it. So the implementation of selecting all of the users who live in Mexico has been abstracted from you, and you are not concerned with how the web browser is passing your article and displaying it to the screen. Your what is Mexican users or a new header and paragraph on your website, and you are not at all concerned with how this particular task is being executed. And in this slide, we'll be discussing about the various subcategories of imperative programming paradigm. The first one is procedural paradigm, next one is object-oriented programming paradigm, and the third one is parallel processing. So, procedural programming breaks down a programming task into a collection of variables and subroutines. It relies heavily on blocks and scope. A typical example is C. Object-oriented programming languages breaks down a programming task into objects that expose behavior, that is methods and data, members or attributes using interfaces or classes. Example is Java. Parallel processing, it uses multiple processing elements simultaneously for solving any problem. Large problems can often be divided into smaller ones which can then be solved at the same time. Example is Apache Hadoop. Here we will see the different subcategories of declarative programming approach. The first one is functional programming paradigm. It binds everything in pure mathematical function style. A typical example is Common Lisp. So you can see some example codes provided there. First one is within parenthesis plus 2 2. It adds 2 and 2 to return the answer 4. So when you execute this, you'll get the answer as 4. Actually, the function name here, everything is written as in the form of a function. So the function name here is plus. Lisp has no operators as such. So another example given is we are declaring a user-defined function called square. So defun is a keyword for defining a new function, a user-defined function named square, and the parameter passed to the function is x. Now within the body of the function we have the statement star x x, which means it's performing the operation x into x. Now when you call the function using the function name and the parameter called 3, square 3, what it does is it performs 3 square to return the answer 9. So here you can see that everything is bound in pure mathematical function style. Even the typical or conventional operators that we see are provided in the form of functions. Next is the logical programming paradigm. It is based on formal logic and it uses clauses with and, or not. Any program written in logical programming language is a set of sentences in logical form expressing facts or rules about some problem domain. Now here we have an example prologue snippet. There we can see some facts written. Man Socrates means that Socrates, the subject here, Socrates is a man. Mortal X is equal to man of X. It means that the implication is that X is a mortal if X is a man. So the first fact is Socrates is a man. The second fact is X is a mortal if X is a man. The question here is whether Socrates is mortal. The third sentence denotes mortal Socrates. That is, it is a query that is Socrates mortal. Now based on the above two rules, we can conclude that Socrates is mortal because Socrates is a man and all men we know are mortal. So that means that it implies that Socrates is mortal. So the next subcategory of declarative programming paradigm is database or data-driven programming paradigm. It is based on data and its movement. Program statements are defined by data rather than hard coding a series of steps. A typical example is SQL, and we have seen the example code that is provided below. Select star from users where country equal to Mexico. Now the final programming paradigm type is symbolic programming paradigm. It manipulates its own formulas and program components as if they were plain data. Example, Wolfram language, Maple and MATLAB. Mathematica's Wolfram language, it's a symbolic programming. It can be visualized as a search and replace system where you program by specifying search and replace rules. For instance, you can have a rule like area equal to pi star radius exponent 2. So next time we encounter the word area, it will be replaced with pi star radius exponent 2. Another programming language called Maple, which is also a symbolic programming language, can manipulate complicated mathematical expressions and find symbolic solutions to certain problems such as those arising from ordinary and partial differential equations. Example, if you want to find the integral of cos x by a dx, you have equivalent methods to find the same in Maple. We can use the function int to find the integral of an expression. So it will take two arguments. The first one is the expression which is to be evaluated. In this particular case, it is cos x by a, and the next one is in terms of the variable in terms of which the integration has to be performed, which is in this case x. So we have integral cos x by a dx, and when you evaluate that expression, you will get the output as a sin x by a. Now we'll start with the concept of names and scopes. A name is a mnemonic character string used to represent something else. We use names to refer to low-level concepts like addresses. Names in most languages are identifiers, alphanumeric tokens, though certain other symbols such as plus or equal to can also be used in names. So in C, there are certain rules to define variable and function names. That is, we have to use alphabets, either capital A to capital Z or small a to small z. We can also use digits as well as special symbols like underscore. However, the name must start with alphabets. Names also allow us to refer to variables, constants, function names, operations, types and so on using symbolic identifiers rather than low-level concepts like address. So here is an example. When we declare a variable called var1 of type int in var1 equal to 10, we have assigned the value 10 effectively to an address, say an address like 10341, and the name that we are going to refer that particular address will be var1 or variable 1. So names are essential to provide abstraction. You might have learned in Java what abstraction means. Abstraction is a process by which the programmer associates a name with a potentially complicated program fragment, which can then be thought of in terms of its purpose or function, rather than in terms of how that function is achieved. A subroutine is a sequence of program instructions that performs a specific task packaged as a unit. In different programming languages, a subroutine may be called a procedure, function, routine, method or a subprogram. So subroutines allow the programmer to hide arbitrarily complicated code behind a simple interface. So let's see an example code snippet provided below. It's a C code, hash include math.h void main. We are declaring three integer variables x, z and y, and we are initializing z as 10 and x as 4, and finally we are just adding up the value in z with the square root of x. So we have provided an abstraction of all these not so complicated in this case, but then all these mathematical operations with a simple name, that is main. So this main function, whenever we refer to it, it will actually it performs all these tasks within it. And another very good example is the square root function in math.h. So whenever we refer to the name square root, we know that the function is going to give us the square root of a parameter that is passed to it. So this is how abstraction is provided using subroutine names. So in the previous slide we were talking about subroutines and control abstraction. Here we will be discussing about classes and data abstraction. A data abstraction is the property by virtue of which only the essential details are displayed to the user. The trivial or non-essential units are not displayed to the user. So when you see a Java class called car, we will think of it in terms of its functionality rather than all the private or public data members that it has and all the methods that it has. So we will think about it only about the overall functionality of the car. So any object-oriented programming language where you implement a class with public and private members is an example of data abstraction. All the private members will be hidden within the class, and the public members, it can be accessed from outside. Here I have provided an example C++ program to illustrate how data abstraction works. We have a class called adder, and it has few public members such as a constructor called adder. It has the same name as the class. And then we have a function called addNum. We have yet another function called getTotal. All of them can be accessed from outside the class because they are all public members. We have another private member called total. It is an integer variable called total. It is hidden from outside world. It can only be accessed by the methods within the class adder. And inside the main function we are instantiating instantiating adder, and we have created an object named A. Now whenever we are instantiating the class adder, the constructor will be automatically called, and we will be assigning the value 0 to the private variable total. Then we are calling the function addNum in adder, and we are passing the parameter 10 to addNum. So what happens within addNum, that the value of total will be incremented with the parameter passed in addNum. So it will be now total will be equal to 0 plus 10, so total equal to 10. Then again we are calling addNum with the parameter 20. So now in this case the value of total will be incremented by 20, so the final value of total will be 30 now. Again we are calling addNum with a new parameter 30, so the value of total will now be incremented by 30 and the final value will be 60. Then finally we are printing the final value of total by calling getTotal, and getTotal function in fact returns the value of total. So it will print total as 60. But if you notice in this case, if we had tried to access the variable total by calling a.total or something, it will cause an error because total is a private member and it cannot be accessed from outside the class adder. So we have discussed about data and control abstractions. Now we'll be discussing about scope. So the scope of a name binding is an association of a name to an entity such as a variable. So you might have encountered this word scope earlier itself, like scope of a variable. So when we declare a variable within a block, we say the scope of the variable is limited within that block. So it is the region of a computer program where the binding is valid. That is where the name can be used to refer to that identity. And such a region is referred to as a scope block. In other parts of the program, the name may refer to a different entity, that is, it may have a different binding, or to nothing at all, it may be unbound, also known as visibility of the entity. To illustrate the concept of scope, I have provided an example C program here. So in this C program, there is a function called sum apart from the main function. And within sum we have two local variables a and b initialized as 10 and 20 respectively, and the function will simply print the sum of a and b, which is 30. From within main we are trying to call function sum, and it will print sum equal to 30. Then we have another printf function, and we are trying to print the value of a and b from main. It is apparent that this will cause an error because a and b are not visible within main. Its scope is restricted to sum. So the term scope is also used to refer to the set of all entities that are visible or names that are valid within a portion of the program or at a given point in the program. It is more correctly referred to as context or environment. The complete set of bindings in effect at a given point in a program is called the current referencing environment. So if you consider the printf statement in main, an error is shown because a and b are not visible in that particular referencing environment. Now we'll see what is meant by static and dynamic scoping. In static scoping, scoping follows the structure of the program. Example, C, C++, Java. In static scoping, the compiler first searches in the current block for a particular variable. If that variable is not visible within the current block, then it will check in the global scope. That is, it will check whether that variable is declared as a global variable. So let's see an example. In this program provided, it's a simple C program. Let's go to the main function. Within the main function, we have two printf statements. In the first printf statement, it's trying to print an integer value, and you can find a function call within that printf statement. It's calling a function called g. Let's go and check what function g does. Within function g, a variable x, a local variable x is declared and initialized as 20. And then it is returning a function call. So it is returning an integer value. In fact, it's returning an integer value, but it's making a function call. So let us go to function f. Within the function f, we can just see the statement return x. So here in this case, within the body of function f, we know that x there is no declaration for x. So since there is no local declaration for x, what the compiler will do is, it will check for the global scope. It will check whether x is available as a global variable. If so, it will take that value of x, the value of the global variable x, and use that value. So this function f will now be returning the value 10, and that value will be returned by g. And finally, the first printf statement will be printing the output as 10. So this whole program will return the value 10. Notice that within g there was a local variable named x itself with the value 20, but that value was never used. This is called static scoping. That is, within function f, first the compiler checked if x is present as a local variable. Since it was not present, it took the value of the global variable x and assigned it to the variable within f. Now we'll see what is meant by dynamic scoping. In dynamic scoping, scoping follows the execution path. So each identifier has a global stack of bindings, and the occurrence of an identifier is searched in the most recent binding. So we have to note this point, that is, the occurrence of an identifier is searched in the most recent binding. In dynamic scoping, the compiler first searches the current block, and then it successively searches all the calling functions. So let's see an example. It will become very clear to you when we discuss this example. This is the same program that we have seen in the previous slide. We are going to check what will be the output if we use dynamic scoping. So within the main function, we have a printf statement wherein we are trying to print an integer value, and we are calling the function g. Within g, we have an integer variable called x, which is initialized as 20, and the function is returning an integer value. In fact, it is making a function called f. Within f, it is returning variable x. However, there is no local declarations for x within f. So in the case of dynamic scoping, it will look for the most recent binding for x. We know that function g had called function x f, and within function g, x was bound to the value 20. So that recent binding of x will be taken into consideration, and that value will be assigned to variable x within f. So now function f will be returning the value 20, and that value will be passed to function g, and function g will also return 20, and finally the main function will print the output as 20. Notice the difference between static and dynamic scoping. In static scoping, we got the output 10 because in the first case, the compiler will check the current scope, and then it will take the value from the global variable. However, in this case, it takes the most recent binding by successively looking at all the calling functions. Now we'll see yet another example for static scoping in Perl. The language Perl supports both dynamic and static scoping. Perl's keyword my defines a statically scoped local variable. and the variable will be available only within the function. While the keyword local defines dynamically scoped local variable, it will be visible also in other functions called by the current function. So we have two keywords in Perl which will help us with static and dynamic scoping. The first one is my. If a variable is preceded with the keyword my, it means that the variable will be available only within the current function where it is defined. While if it is preceded by the keyword local, it means that it can be seen also in other functions called by the current function. So it defines a dynamically scoped local variable. Now let's go to the example. Here in this code snippet, you can see that there is a global variable called x which is initialized as 50. In Perl, you need not specify the data type of variables. It will be automatically assigned by the interpreter based on the context of the data. And we have two user-defined functions, fun2 and fun1. And the last statement, the last code statement is a print statement. It is printing the value returned by fun1. So it is a function call also. We have a function call. Let's go to the body of fun1. There we have two variables, two local variables x and y. Both of them are preceded by the keyword my, which implies that they are both statically scoped local variables available only within fun1. X is initialized as 10. Local variable x is initialized as 10, while the local variable y will contain the value returned by fun2. So this program code is essentially the same as the previous C program that we have seen. So let's go to fun2, the body of fun2. Within fun2, we have only one statement, that is return x, and here x is not defined. So since we are using static scoping using the keyword my, what happens is the interpreter will automatically assign the value of the global variable x in this context. So since x is not defined in fun2, the value of the global variable x will be used in this case, and fun2 will return the value 50, and fun1 will again return the value 50, and the value 50 will be printed as the final output. Now we'll see what happens in the same program when we use dynamic scoping. So the entire code will be exactly the same except for the fact that we are using the keyword local in fun1. So if you look at the body of the function, user-defined function fun1, variable x is now preceded by the keyword local. Now this implies a dynamically scoped variable. So x will also be visible in all the programs that are all the functions that are called by fun1. So it will also be visible in fun2. So we have the same print function at the end, print fun1. So now we are calling fun1, and the value of fun1, value returned by fun1, will be printed as the output of the program. So let's go to the body of fun1. There we have the initialization of the local variable x, which is now a dynamically scoped local variable, and its value is initialized as 10. And we have a statically scoped variable y because it is preceded by the keyword my, and it will store the value returned by fun2. Now we have a function called fun2 for fun2, and as we know, fun2 will be returning the value of x. However, x is not defined in fun2. So since we are using a dynamic scoping, what the interpreter will do is it will take the most recent active binding of x. So x has been assigned the value 10 most recently in fun1. So that value will be taken and assigned to x in fun2. So now instead of returning the global variable value 50, fun2 will be returning the value 10, and fun1 in turn will return the same value 10, and the final output will be 10. Now we'll see what is meant by binding. A binding is an association between two things, such as a name and the thing it names. So the conventional idea is that binding refers to assigning a name to a memory location, like the case when we name a variable. However, binding means much more than that. For instance, when we are assigning the keywords like while, for, etc., we are actually associating them with looping constructs in the programming language. Or when we decide names such as int, float, etc., these names are associated with the data types in these languages, or the precision of data types. So all these names and their binding and their association with the thing it names is called binding. A source file has many names whose properties need to be determined. The meaning of these properties might be determined at different phases of the life cycle of a program. Example of such properties include the set of values associated with a type, the type of a variable, the precision of a data type, memory location of the compile function, the values stored in a variable, and so forth. Binding is the act of associating properties with names. Binding time is the moment in the program's life cycle when this association occurs. Binding time is the time at which a binding is created, or more generally the time at which any implementation decision is made. Many programming language properties are defined during its creation. For instance, the meaning of keywords such as while or for in C, or the size of integer data types in Java are properties defined at language design time. Another important binding phase is the language implementation time. The size of integers in C, contrary to Java, were not defined when C was designed. This information is determined by the implementation of the compiler. Therefore, we say that the size of integers in C is determined at language implementation time. Similarly, there are many different times at which decisions may be bound, like program writing time, compile time, link time, load time, or run time. We'll see examples of each.
So at language design time, control flow constructs like while, for, the set of fundamental primitive data types such as in, float, the available constructors for creating complex types like enum in C, and many other aspects of language semantics are chosen. During the language implementation time, the precision of the fundamental data types, the organization and maximum sizes of stack and heap, and the handling of runtime exceptions are determined. At program writing time, programmers of course choose algorithms, data structures, and names of variables or functions. At compile time, we know that in C and C++ macro replacement happens. Address binding is the association of program instructions and data to the actual physical memory location. If the compiler is responsible for performing address binding, it is called compile time address binding. Suppose you have made a user-defined function called sum, whose declaration is as under int sum int in. So it has two integer parameters and it returns an integer data type element. Then whenever the function is called from your program should know where to jump in memory to execute that function. In simple terms, call function's address should be known to your program in order to reach to its body, which is also called as address binding. Now we'll discuss about address binding in detail. Whenever you create a variable such as count or sum in your source code, you're actually generating symbolic references to some addresses. A compiler will typically bind these symbolic addresses to relocatable address such as 14 bytes from the beginning of this module. The linkage editor or loader will in turn bind the relocatable address to absolute address such as a specific memory location 74014. Each binding is a mapping from one address space to another. Classically, the binding of instructions and data to memory addresses can be done at any step along the way. So if you know at compile time where the process will reside in memory, then the compiler can directly generate absolute addresses, absolute code. So this is called static binding. That is, the compiler translates symbolic address references to absolute addresses. Now if the compiler does not know where the process will reside in memory at compile time, then the compiler must generate relocatable code from symbolic addresses. The loader will translate these relocatable addresses, relative relocatable addresses to absolute addresses. Now, if the process can be moved during its execution from one memory segment to another, then binding must be delayed until runtime. the absolute addresses are generated by hardware. So this is called as dynamic or execution time binding. Now we'll see what happens at link time. When we talk about link time or linking in general, we get reminded of external libraries, linking external libraries in C program or C++ programs, etc. So a library is a collection of pre-compiled object files which can be linked into programs. The most common use of libraries is to provide system functionalities such as square root function, that is sqrt function found in the C math library, or printf function in stdio library. So link time is the time at which multiple object codes and libraries are combined into one executable. And we have already discussed about address binding during load time and run time or execution time. So this table is just a summarization of whatever we have discussed in the previous three slides. I would urge you to go through it carefully. There are some examples given for each language feature and the corresponding binding time. So if you study it, it will be helpful for your exam. Now we will see an example of static binding in Java. The binding which can be resolved at compile time by the compiler is known as static or early binding. In the context of Java, binding of all the static, private and final methods is done at compile time. So here we have a main class called new class. Within that we have a public static class, superclass. Within superclass we have a single method, static method called print, which has a single print statement, print in superclass. We have yet another class called subclass which extends superclass, and it also has another static method with the same name, print, and it has the print statement, print in subclass. Now we have created, within the main function, we have created one object of subclass and one object of superclass with the reference of the superclass. So when we call the print function, first print function, a.print, since the print method of the superclass is static, compiler knows that it will not be overridden in the subclass, and hence compiler knows during compile time which print method to call, and hence there is no ambiguity. In this case, since the print function in the superclass is static, we will always get the statement, print statement as print in superclass. In both cases, in a.print as well as in b.print, the print statement executed will be the one in the superclass, and we will get the output as print in superclass, print in superclass. So this is an example of static binding. Now we will see an example of dynamic binding in Java. In dynamic binding, the compiler doesn't decide the method to be called. Overriding is a perfect example of dynamic binding. Now the program code that is given here is exactly the same as the one that we have seen previously, except for the fact that the print methods in the superclass and subclass are no longer static. If you notice, both of them do not have the static keyword preceding them. And within the main function, again we are creating two objects, object A for the superclass and object B for subclass with the references of the superclass. And when we call the function when we call the function print using the first statement a.print, there is no confusion. It will print in superclass. However, when we use the second method B, second object b and call the function print b.print. Now what happens is the compiler will not be able to decide which method to be called, and the binding will be delayed till runtime. So this is an example of dynamic binding in Java. Now we will discuss about the effect of static and dynamic binding. Early binding or static binding are associated with greater efficiency. That is, the binding decision will be made at compile time. Compilers try to fix decisions that can be taken at compile time to avoid to generate code that makes a decision at runtime. Syntax and static semantic checking is performed only once at compile time and does not impose any runtime overheads. Whereas late or dynamic binding is associated with greater flexibility. In some programming languages, interpreters allow programs to be extended at runtime. Languages such as Smalltalk AT with polymorphic types allow variable names to refer to objects of multiple types at runtime. Method binding in object-oriented languages like Java must be late to support dynamic binding, as we have discussed previously. Now, binding lifetime is the time between the creation and destruction of a binding object. Example, a pointer variable is set to the address of an object. A formal argument is bound to an actual argument.